Bookie.com, I'm telling you. It's a sure thing. My friend grinned, leaning back in his chair, a little too pleased with himself. It's all settled then. You're coming with me. And where, may I ask, are you dragging me off to? Brighton, he declared with a dramatic flourish. A friend in the city gave me a tip. Let's just say I'm in a position to splurge a little. A weekend at the Grand Metropolitan is just what we need. Well, I said, unable to resist. Thank you. I'll come with pleasure. It's rather thoughtful of you to include me in this extravagance. Poirot, sitting beside me, smiled warmly. Ah, Hastings. It is always the heart that triumphs in the end, not the gray cells. Yes, even I must remind myself of that sometimes. His words had a hint of condescension, as if he were gently poking fun at my intellect. It stung, but his excitement was contagious, so I chose to let it slide. By Saturday evening, we were dining at the Grand Metropolitan amidst a dazzling sea of fashion and elegance. The crowd was abuzz with energy, and the room shimmered with an array of extravagant jewelry, some worn with more enthusiasm than taste. Magnificent, isn't it? Murmured Poirot, surveying the opulence around us. The perfect playground for the wealthy, and for the criminally inclined. Brighton has its reputation, I replied, smiling. Poirot's gaze lingered on a stout woman near a pillar, her neck and wrists glinting with jewels. Look there, Hastings. That one is practically draped in treasure. What a tempting sight for a thief of distinction, no? I followed his gaze and recognized her immediately. That's Mrs. Opalson, I exclaimed. She's married to a stockbroker who made his fortune in the oil boom. Later, we encountered the Opalsons in the lounge, and I introduced Poirot to the couple. Over coffee, Mrs. Opalson lit up as Poirot complimented the sparkling gems adorning her neck. Jewelry is my passion, Mr. Poirot, she gushed. Ed knows it too. Whenever he does well, he treats me to something new. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Ah, madame, I have had the pleasure of encountering many extraordinary jewels in my career. Each stone has its story. He launched into a tale of a legendary set of jewels once owned by royalty, his words weaving a spell. Mrs. Opalson listened, captivated, her breath bated. When he finished, she clapped her hands together. Oh, how marvelous! You know, I have a pearl necklace with its own fascinating history. It's said to be one of the finest in the world. The pearls are perfectly matched, just exquisite. You must see it. Poirot protested politely. Madame, I could not ask you to go to such trouble. Nonsense, I'll fetch it right now, she insisted, bustling off toward the lift with surprising speed. Her husband chuckled, shaking his head. The pearls are worth a fortune. Cost me a small fortune, too, but they're an investment. I could sell them tomorrow and get every penny back, maybe even more, the way things are going in the city. He began rambling about the financial markets, though most of it went over my head. A small page boy interrupted us, whispering something in his ear. Opalson frowned, nodded, and excused himself. Poirot, calm as ever, watched the exchange with quiet interest. A simple necklace, he said softly. And yet, what trouble it could invite. I'll come at once. Not sick, is she? Mr. Opalson's face tightened as he abruptly excused himself, leaving us behind. Poirot leaned back, calm as ever, and lit one of his dainty Russian cigarettes. With precise care, he rearranged the empty coffee cups in a perfect line, a contented smile spreading across his face as if he had just solved a puzzle. Minutes ticked by. Still no sign of the Opalsons. I glanced at my watch. Curious, I murmured. What's keeping them so long? Poirot exhaled a thin spiral of smoke, his eyes thoughtful. They will not come back. I frowned. What? Why not? My dear Hastings, he said, his voice low but steady, something has happened. I leaned closer, intrigued. Happened? What do you mean? How do you know? Poirot raised a hand, motioning for patience. A few moments ago, the hotel manager rushed upstairs in a state of great agitation. The lift boy, meanwhile, has been deep in conversation with a page, ignoring the lift bell that rang thrice. And finally, the waiters. Ah, Hastings. Even the waiters are distracted. To make a waiter distrait? That is no small affair. Mon ami, the situation must be of the highest magnitude. I opened my mouth to respond, but Poirot raised a brow and nodded toward the entrance. Voila, as I suspected, here come the police. 2 men had entered the hotel, one in uniform, the other plain-clothed. After speaking briefly with a page, they disappeared upstairs. Moments later, the same page boy approached us. Mr. Opalson's compliments, sir, and would you please come upstairs? Poirot sprang to his feet, his movements as nimble as a cat. Come, Hastings, he called, already heading for the stairs. I hurried after him, my pulse quickening. The Opalson suite was located on the first floor. A sharp knock from the page boy was met with a muffled, "Come in." When we stepped inside, the scene that greeted us could only be described as chaos. In the center of the room, Mrs. Opalson sat slumped in a chair, her broad frame trembling as she sobbed uncontrollably. Her heavily powdered face was streaked with tears, the pale foundation smeared into uneven patches. Mr. Opalson paced the room like a caged tiger, his steps heavy with frustration. 2 police officers stood near the center of the room, one jotting notes in a small notebook, the other scanning the scene with an air of disinterest. A terrified chambermaid hovered by the fireplace, her hands wringing nervously. On the opposite side of the room, a Frenchwoman, evidently Mrs. Opalson's maid, sobbed into a handkerchief, her anguish almost theatrical in its intensity. Poirot entered the room with a calm and confident smile, utterly unfazed by the commotion. Mrs. Opalson, spotting him, shot up from her chair with surprising speed. "Oh, Mr. Poirot," she cried, clasping her hands together. "It's fate, I tell you, fate. Meeting you tonight was a sign. If anyone can get my pearls back, it's you." Poirot stepped forward, taking her hand with a gentle pat. "Calm yourself, madam. Rest assured, Hercule Poirot will aid you. All will be well." Mr. Opalson turned to the police inspector, his voice gruff. "I hope there's no objection to me calling in Mr. Poirot?" "None at all, sir," the inspector replied with a casual shrug. "Perhaps now, Mrs. Opalson, you can tell us exactly what happened." The lady looked helplessly at Poirot, who led her back to her chair with a reassuring nod. "Take a deep breath, madam, and recount the events. Do not distress yourself further." Mrs. Opalson dabbed her eyes and began, her voice trembling. "I came upstairs after dinner to fetch my pearls. The chambermaid and Celestine, my maid, were both in the room, as usual." Poirot raised a hand. "Pardon, madam, but what do you mean by 'as usual'?" Mr. Opalson interjected. "No one is allowed into this room unless Celestine is present. It's a strict rule of mine. The chambermaid does her work in the morning under Celestine's watch and only returns in the evening to turn down the beds, again with Celestine present. Otherwise the room is locked." Mrs. Opalson nodded quickly. "Yes, exactly. So I went to the dressing table." She gestured toward a polished knee-hole table on the far side of the room. I opened the bottom right drawer where I keep my jewel case. It was locked, just as I'd left it. But when I unlocked it, her voice cracked and she clutched her throat. The pearls, they were gone. The inspector, still scribbling in his notebook, looked up. "When did you last see them?" "This evening, before dinner," she replied firmly. I wasn't sure whether to wear the pearls or my emeralds. I chose the emeralds and put the pearls back in the case, locking it before heading downstairs. Poirot's eyes gleamed as he leaned forward. "Fascinating," he murmured. "Did you wear the key on a chain around your neck?" the inspector asked, examining the key Mrs. Opalson had just produced. Mrs. Opalson nodded. "Yes, of course." The inspector shrugged, clearly unconcerned. "Ah, the thief must have had a duplicate key then. Not a difficult matter. Your lock is quite simple." Mrs. Opalson frowned, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "But what about the drawer? I always leave it unlocked." The inspector's gaze sharpened. "So, to confirm, the jewels were in the case when you went to dinner, and since then the maid hasn't left the room?" Suddenly, as if struck by the weight of the situation, Celestine, Mrs. Opalson's maid, let out a blood-curdling shriek, throwing herself at Poirot. "Infamous!" she cried, her voice rising in furious French. "How dare you accuse me of this crime? You think I would steal from Madame? The police, they're so stupid." Poirot raised a hand to silence her, his voice cool. "Madam, I must ask that you calm yourself." But Celestine wasn't listening. Her rage boiled over. "That chambermaid, she's the thief. She's always been a thief, a liar. I've watched her since she started working here." She gestured wildly, her words spilling forth in a rapid torrent of French. The chambermaid stood, stiff as a board, but then spoke with cold defiance. "It's a lie. I didn't take the pearls." "Oh, but you did," Celestine retorted, her eyes blazing. "Search her. You'll find them on her, I'm sure of it." The chambermaid's eyes narrowed in fury. "You're mad, Celestine. Why don't you look at yourself first? You're the one who's always sneaking around." Poirot stepped in, his voice steady as he addressed Celestine. "Is it true, Celestine? Did you leave the room?" Celestine hesitated, her eyes darting nervously. "I didn't leave her alone, but I did go into my own room twice, to fetch some cotton and my scissors, that's all." The chambermaid snorted. "A minute, if that. You were barely gone. Meanwhile, you sat like a cat watching a mouse from your chair." Poirot remained calm, but the tension in the room thickened. Just then, there was a knock at the door. The inspector moved swiftly to open it, his face lighting up at the sight of the newcomer. "Ah, perfect timing," he said. "I've called for one of our female searchers and she's just arrived." He turned to the chambermaid. "If you wouldn't mind stepping into the next room." The chambermaid tossed her head, striding across the threshold with a haughty look. The searcher followed close behind her. Celestine slumped into a chair, tears of frustration brimming in her eyes. Poirot stood, surveying the room with his usual intensity. The inspector approached Poirot, his voice curious. "Where does that door lead?" he asked, nodding toward the door by the window. Poirot glanced at it, eyes narrowing. "That leads into the next apartment," he said, moving toward it. "But it's bolted on this side." Poirot tried the door anyway. He pushed back the bolt, checking the mechanism. Then he tried the door again, inspecting the other side. "Well," he said, stepping back, "that seems to rule out that possibility." Poirot moved to the windows next, scrutinizing each one with meticulous care. He checked every angle, but there was nothing. No balcony, no escape route. Just a dead end. "Even if there were," said the inspector, growing impatient, "I still don't see how that helps us. The maid never left the room." "Ah, but you're overlooking something, my friend," Poirot replied, unshaken. "Mademoiselle insists she never left." Before the inspector could respond, the chambermaid and the police searcher returned. "Nothing," the searcher reported flatly. "I should hope not," the chambermaid chimed in. her tone prim and self-righteous. "That French hussy should be ashamed, accusing me of stealing her pearls." There, my girl, it's all right," the inspector said, opening the door. "No one suspects you. Go along and get back to your duties." The chambermaid hesitated, glancing at Celestine. "Go search her instead," she demanded. Yes, the inspector replied, shutting the door behind the chambermaid. "Go along now, no more fuss." Celestine and the searcher went into the small adjoining room. A few minutes later, Celestine reappeared, and the inspector's expression darkened. "Nothing," she muttered, still visibly shaken. The inspector sighed, his tone now grim. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to come with me, mademoiselle," he said to Celestine. Turning to Mrs. Opelson, he added, "I'm sorry, madam, but all the evidence points that way. If she hasn't got them on her, then they must be hidden somewhere in the room." At that, Celestine let out a blood-curdling shriek and clung to Poirot's arm, shaking uncontrollably. Poirot bent down, whispering something in her ear. She looked up at him, confused, but he gave her a reassuring nod. "Come now," he said softly. "It's better not to resist." Turning to the inspector, he asked, "May I propose a little experiment purely for my own satisfaction?" The inspector raised an eyebrow. "It depends on what it is," he replied, his tone non-committal. Poirot turned to Celestine again. "You told us you went to your room to fetch a reel of cotton. Where was it?" "On the top of the chest of drawers," Celestine replied. "And the scissors?" Poirot pressed. Celestine nodded, clearly nervous. "Yes, the scissors were there too." "Would it be too much trouble, mademoiselle," Poirot asked, "to repeat those actions for me?" Celestine, clearly unsure of what was happening, reluctantly rose at Poirot's signal. She moved into the adjoining room, picked up an object from the chest of drawers, and returned. Poirot, ever the meticulous observer, divided his attention between her movements and the large, turnip-like watch he held in his hand. "Once more, if you please, mademoiselle," Poirot requested. After the second performance, Poirot made a note in his pocketbook and carefully returned the watch to his pocket. "Thank you, mademoiselle," he said politely, bowing to her. Celestine, in a fit of tears, was escorted away by the female searcher and the plain-clothes officer. The inspector, now growing somewhat entertained by Poirot's peculiar methods, turned to Mrs. Opelson with an apologetic look. "I'm sorry, madam," the inspector said, "but I must proceed with the search." He immediately set to work, pulling out drawers, opening cupboards, unmaking the bed, and tapping the floor for hidden compartments. Mr. Opelson watched skeptically from the corner. "You really think you'll find them?" he asked, voice dripping with doubt. "Yes, sir," Poirot answered calmly. "It stands to reason. She had no time to remove them from the room. The discovery was made too soon. They're here, right enough." "One of the two must have hidden them," Poirot continued, "and it's highly unlikely the chambermaid did so. More than unlikely, impossible." The inspector stared at him, stunned. Poirot smiled modestly. "I will demonstrate, Hastings, my good friend." He pulled out his watch. "Take care with it. It is a family heirloom." Poirot looked at the watch with intense concentration. "Just now, I timed Mademoiselle's movements. Her first absence from the room lasted precisely 12 seconds. The second was 15 inches. He glanced up, meeting the inspector's gaze. "Now, observe carefully, madame," Poirot said gently. "Will you have the kindness to give me the key to the jewel case?" His voice was smooth, yet there was an air of quiet authority. "I thank you," he added, turning toward me with a glint in his eyes. "Hastings, will you have the kindness to say, 'Go'?" Before I could respond, Poirot moved with lightning speed. In a single, fluid motion, he wrenched open the drawer of the dressing table, retrieved the jewel case, and with expert precision slid the key into the lock. The case clicked open, and Poirot selected a piece of jewelry with deliberate care. He shut the case, locked it, and returned it to the drawer, pushing it shut once again. His movements were so swift they were almost too fast to follow. "Well, mon ami," Poirot asked, his eyes twinkling, "how long did that take?" 46 seconds, I replied, still astonished by the efficiency of his actions. Poirot turned to the inspector. "You see," he said calmly, "there would not have been time for the chambermaid to even take the necklace out, let alone hide it." The inspector's face brightened. "Then that settles it. The maid is the thief," he said with evident satisfaction, returning to his search. Poirot, however, was deep in thought. As the inspector moved into the maid's bedroom next door, Poirot turned to Mr. Opelson. "This necklace," he asked suddenly, his eyes narrowing. "It was undoubtedly insured." Mr. Opelson seemed momentarily taken aback by the question. "Yes," he said slowly, "but what does that matter?" Mrs. Opelson burst into the conversation, her voice trembling with emotion. "It's my necklace. It was unique. No money could ever replace it." "I comprehend, madam," Poirot soothed, nodding sympathetically. "But perhaps Monsieur Opelson will find some slight consolation in the insurance value." "Of course," Mr. Opelson agreed, though his tone was uncertain. He was about to say more when the inspector returned, triumphantly dangling something from his fingers. "Mrs. Opelson," the inspector exclaimed, "look what I've found." Mrs. Opelson leapt from her chair with a gasp. "Oh, my necklace!" she cried, clutching it to her chest with both hands. We crowded around her, and the inspector, still beaming, gestured toward the maid's bed. "It was hidden in the springs of the mattress," he declared. "She must have stolen it and concealed it there before the chambermaid arrived on the scene." Poirot, ever the picture of calm, nodded and stepped forward. "Madame," he said gently, "you permit?" He took the necklace from her, examining it with the scrutiny of an expert. Poirot's fingers traced the delicate design, and after a moment he handed the necklace back with a bow. "I'm afraid, madam, you will have to hand it over to us for the time being," he said politely. "We shall want it for the charge, but it shall be returned to you as soon as possible." Mr. Opelson frowned. "Is that necessary?" he asked, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm afraid so, sir," the inspector replied. "It's just a formality." Mrs. Opelson, clearly desperate, urged him on. "Let him take it," she cried. "I'd feel safer if he did. I wouldn't sleep a wink thinking someone else might try and steal it. That wretched girl." There, my dear," Mr. Opelson said, attempting to comfort his wife. I felt a gentle pressure on my arm. It was Poirot. "Shall we slip away, my friend?" he suggested quietly. "I think our services are no longer needed here." Once outside, however, Poirot paused, his brow furrowing in thought. "I should like to see the room next door," he said after a moment. I was taken aback. "What for?" "It will help," he replied, his voice thoughtful. We entered the large, unoccupied room next door, and as soon as Poirot saw the dust on the furniture, he grimaced. "The service leaves much to be desired," he observed dryly, running his finger around a rectangular mark on a table near the window. Poirot stared out the window, deep in thought, seemingly lost in his own world. "What is it?" I asked impatiently. "What did we come in here for?" Poirot turned slowly, his gaze still distant. "I wanted to see if the door was really bolted on this side," he said at last. I glanced at the door that connected the two rooms. "It's bolted," I confirmed. "But what does it matter? The case is over." Poirot shook his head, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "The case is not over, my friend. It will not be over until we find out who stole the pearls." "But the maid did," I protested. Poirot smiled placidly. "Non, mon ami, those pearls were not the real ones." The words struck me like a thunderclap. "What? But the necklace was found in her mattress." Poirot nodded, still calm. "Ah, my friend, those were not the true pearls. They were merely imitation." I was speechless. "But how can you be sure?" Poirot's smile widened. "It's simple, Hastings. The good inspector obviously knows nothing about jewels, but soon there will be quite a commotion, mark my words." I was flabbergasted. "We must tell the Opalsons." Poirot's expression grew serious. "I think not, my friend. That poor woman—" "You mean Mrs. Opalson?" Yes, Poirot continued. "She will sleep better tonight, believing the jewels are safe. The thief, however, may still escape with them. We must wait." I shook my head, confused. "How do you know they aren't the real ones?" Poirot gave me a long, knowing look. "How do you know that the pearls Mrs. Opalson locked away tonight weren't false to begin with? Perhaps the real robbery happened much earlier." I was stunned. "But how?" Poirot grinned. "Exactly. You see now." With a dramatic flourish, Poirot led me out of the room, pausing briefly as if considering something, then heading toward the small den at the end of the corridor where the chambermaids and valets gathered. "Let's see what we can learn here, my friend," Poirot murmured. She appeared to be holding court, recounting her recent experiences to a captivated audience. In the middle of a sentence, she suddenly paused as Poirot entered the room with his signature polite bow. "Excuse me, madame. I beg your pardon for disturbing you," Poirot said smoothly. "But I would be grateful if you could kindly unlock Mr. Opalson's room for me." Rose, the chambermaid, readily complied, and we followed her down the corridor once again. Mr. Opalson's room was on the opposite side, its door facing his wife's. With a deft twist of her passkey, Rose unlocked the door, allowing us to enter. Before she left, Poirot called her back. "One moment, mademoiselle. Have you ever seen this among Mr. Opalson's effects?" He held out a plain white card, its surface highly glazed and almost unusual in appearance. The maid took it and studied it closely, her brow furrowing. "No, sir," she replied. "I can't say I have, but the valet handles most of Mr. Opalson's things." "Thank you," Poirot said, taking the card back. Rose departed, and Poirot seemed to drift into thought. "Ring for the valet, Hastings," he instructed suddenly. 3 times, please." I did as he asked, my curiosity growing. Poirot, however, was already focused on the wastepaper basket, emptying its contents onto the floor and sifting through them with remarkable speed. A moment later, the valet entered, and Poirot asked the same question, handing him the card to inspect. The response was the same as before. The valet had never seen such a card in Mr. Opalson's belongings. Poirot thanked him, and the valet left with a look of mild curiosity at the scattered papers. He couldn't have missed Poirot's muttered remark as he carefully gathered the torn bits back together. And the necklace was heavily insured. I blinked. "Poirot, I see." Poirot gave me a sidelong glance, his expression inscrutable. "Ah, you see nothing, my friend. Nothing at all. It is incredible, but there it is." With that, Poirot gestured for us to return to our rooms. Once there, to my complete surprise, Poirot quickly began changing his clothes. "I'm leaving for London tonight," he explained, his voice firm. "It is imperative." "London?" I repeated, a little stunned. "But why?" "The real work, Hastings," Poirot replied with a dramatic pause, his eyes lighting up with the familiar gleam of his little gray cells at work. "It is done. I go to seek the confirmation. Poirot, you're going to come a cropper one of these days, I remarked, a touch of exasperation in my voice. He ignored my comment with a serene smile. Do not be angry, mon ami. I am counting on you to do me a small favor, as a friend. Of course, Poirot, I agreed eagerly, though somewhat baffled. What is it? Poirot gestured to his coat, which he had just removed. This sleeve, he said, pointing to a small patch of white powder. Will you brush it for me? You no doubt saw me run my finger around the drawer of the dressing table. I hadn't noticed, but I obediently took the coat and examined the sleeve. What is this powder, Poirot? I asked, not particularly interested in his usual antics. Ah, not poison, Hastings, he replied with a twinkle in his eye. It is not the poison of the Boers, no. I blinked, intrigued. Then what is it? French chalk, Poirot said simply, his smile widening. French chalk, I repeated, confused. Yes, Poirot confirmed. Cabinet makers use it to make drawers run smoothly. I laughed, relieved. Ah, Poirot, I thought you were building up to something more dramatic. Poirot chuckled lightly. Mon ami, I save myself, I fly. With that, he swiftly left, the door shutting behind him with a half-affectionate, half-derisive smile. I stood there, a bit taken aback by his sudden departure. Shaking my head, I reached for the clothes brush, still pondering Poirot's odd behavior. The next morning, hearing nothing from Poirot, I decided to take a stroll to clear my mind. It was an unusual day, and I had a growing sense that something far more interesting than we had yet discovered was about to unfold. The afternoon passed quickly as I lunched with some old friends at their hotel. We went for a drive afterward, but a punctured tire delayed us. By the time I returned to the Grand Metropolitan, it was already past 8. The first sight that greeted me was Poirot, looking even smaller than usual, squeezed between the Opalsons, both of them beaming with satisfaction. Hastings, Poirot cried, rushing over to embrace me. My friend, all has gone marvelously. I froze, unsure what to make of it. The embrace was, fortunately, figurative, something I always find myself unsure of with Poirot. Do you mean, I began, still trying to piece things together. Wonderful, I call it, Mrs. Opalson said, her wide smile practically taking over her face. Didn't I tell you, Ed, that if he couldn't get back my pearls, no one would? You did, my dear, you did, Mr. Opalson agreed, a hint of pride in his voice. I looked helplessly at Poirot, seeking an explanation. He caught my glance and answered with a casual shrug. My friend, he said with a twinkle, as they say in England, all at the seaside, seat yourself, and I will recount to you the affair that has ended so happily. Ended? I repeated, still confused. Of course they are arrested, Poirot continued. Arrested? Who? The chambermaid and the valet, Poirot replied, looking pleased with himself. You did not suspect? I stared at him, stunned. Not with my parting hint about the French chalk, he said knowingly. Cabinet makers use it to make drawers slide easily, but someone wanted that drawer to slide without making a sound. Who, I wonder? His voice dropped into a tone of quiet satisfaction. Only the truly dynamic and bold could pull that off. The plan, so brilliantly conceived, was not immediately apparent, not even to the sharp eyes of Hercule Poirot himself. Here is what happened, Poirot explained, with that glint in his eyes that made even the most seemingly ordinary situations feel like masterful plots. The valet was waiting in the empty room next door, concealed and ready. The French maid leaves, swift as a shadow. That's when the chambermaid swoops in. She opens the drawer, grabs the jewel case, and with a speed born of careful practice, slips the bolt back on the door. She passes it through the door to the valet, who has the duplicate key to open it at his leisure. Poirot paused for dramatic effect, knowing I was on the edge of my seat. He takes the necklace, stashes it away, and waits for the perfect moment. The maid comes back, the case is passed back again, and is swiftly replaced in the drawer. Madame enters. The theft is discovered. The chambermaid, with feigned horror, demands to be searched and, of course, leaves the room without a speck of guilt to her name. I stared, trying to grasp the depth of it all. Poirot's smile was all-knowing. And the final touch, mon ami. The imitation necklace was cleverly hidden in the French maid's bed earlier that morning. A masterpiece of misdirection, wouldn't you agree? But what about your trip to London? I asked, eager to piece the puzzle together. Poirot's eyes sparkled with delight as he continued. You remember the card? It puzzled me too, but it was all part of the plan. A special surface for fingerprints. I went straight to Scotland Yard and consulted our old friend, the inspector. As I suspected, the prints were from two notorious jewel thieves who had been evading the law for some time. The moment I arrived, I laid the facts out. We took the thieves down together, and there, hidden on the valet, the necklace. Poirot smiled in that infuriatingly modest way of his. A clever pair, he conceded, but they missed one thing: method. As I've told you, Hastings, at least 36 times, a plan without method is doomed to fail. I couldn't help but laugh. 36,000, more like. Poirot raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. You see, mon ami, they made a critical error. Yes, taking the role of a chambermaid or a valet is clever, but one must not skip the details. They left the room undusted. When the valet placed the jewel case on the small table near the door, he left a telltale mark. A square, perfectly visible mark. I blinked. Of course. I remember now. Mrs. Opelson, having overheard, chimed in with a dramatic flourish. And I've got my pearls back. Poirot gave a satisfied nod. Exactly, madame. I turned to Poirot. Well, I suppose dinner is in order. He looked at me with a knowing smile. Indeed, it is. But I must say, Hastings, this should earn you some kudos. However, the local inspector will divide the credit with the rest of us. He tapped his pocket as if he were a magician pulling a rabbit from a hat. And here, mon ami, is the check Mr. Opelson kindly sent me. I raised an eyebrow. And what about us? What's next? Poirot, ever the mystery, gave a small shrug. Shall we return next weekend? My treat. And just like that, the case was over, or so I thought. But with Poirot, nothing is ever truly over.